consciousness is the starting point of reality.
Completely antithetical to that attitude in science.
What is reality?
We're now at this great inflection.
Video games and all of that is actually the most important spiritual tools we've got today.
The whole point of a virtual reality is to have useful fiction of causality.
The individual never gets enlightened. It's the enlightenment that becomes the individual.
Space-time is doomed.
Consciousness is fundamental.
Einstein's theory actually predicts its own demise.
Balance is not the ability to stand up, it's the ability to rise up.
Please like, comment, and subscribe.
The question that made me ask you to explain it a little bit further is that as we learn and get these puzzle pieces and transcend our previous conceptions or previous spiritual level, if it disappears, I don't think by that you're meaning that you've lost everything that you had there. You've gotten a deeper awareness. It's sort of like in science, for example, when Newton was physics for a couple centuries, and then when Einstein and quantum theory came along, we transcended Newton.
Yes.
But what the way physicists think about it is that it's not that Newton disappeared. Newton, in some sense, is incredibly beautiful and powerful, and it's almost like on its own terms, it's this incredibly beautiful structure. And we have transcended. We've gone to a new and deeper structure, but we can look back at the previous structure and actually admire its own local perfection, its own local completeness, even though we're no longer stuck in it. And we see, so that's before Newton was maybe the resistance in the sense that we assumed that the world was deterministic. That was our worldview, and so the resistance was going beyond determinism into a non-deterministic and so forth. But once we transcended, so it disappeared in the sense that it was no longer our worldview, but it remained as a thing of beauty and a thing of instruction to us that we could keep as we move on to Einstein and quantum theory, and presumably as we transcend Einstein and quantum theory and go beyond space-time itself.
Yes.
When we look back, we will we will in some sense space-time will have disappeared in the sense that we're no longer addicted to that point of view.
Exactly.
And yet we will keep it as again a beautiful thing that continues to teach us, but we're no longer stuck in it. Is that sort of what
exactly
you're saying?
Because for a very long time, space-time has been real, and very soon it won't be. So it basically instructs the mind in how we see the world and how we interact with it. Because when space-time is absolute, you will not even be able to comprehend and come up with the idea that there is something beyond it because it's absolute. Once you understand that it's not, all of a sudden, you understand, you have an intuition that, okay, there is something beyond it. It instructs how the mind relates to reality and how one sees it, and therefore it also changes what you see. So it basically, it represents different templates. And once you get it, you grow out of it. And it will no longer be defining, how you operate. And basically, it's not only how you see the world, but your world will change because you have less resistance. And therefore, you see things differently. It's basically just like a child, will have a different sense of logic and a different value system than an adult, and will interpret situations and experiences very differently. It's the same world, and yet it's not.
Right. Very good. So I think that makes deep sense. And you're right that in the case of space-time, if you're thinking that space-time is the fundamental reality, then you're going to have a conceptual straitjacket
Exactly.
that will not let you tackle certain problems. The question of what's beyond space-time becomes almost
Mm.
nonsense, whereas now state-of-the-art physicists are freely talking about structures beyond space-time, the
Yeah.
amplitude-hedron and space-hedron
Mm.
and so forth, cosmological polytopes. They're finding these structures that are beyond space-time. So they're whereas if space-time is the fundamental reality, you wouldn't even be looking for those structures, and the very concept of those structures being of things beyond space-time would be, in some sense, nonsensical because space-time is everything.
Exactly.
That's all there is. And so there is now I'm as a scientist, I wonder if we can come up with what we call a scale-free
Mm.
approach to this
Yeah.
transcendence idea, so that and I'm not saying I think that this is true. I'm just asking the question. I mean, it would be convenient if it were
Hmm.
true, but I'm not sure. But the idea, if it were true, that there is a scale-free way of understanding this
There is,
transcendence,
and I can explain it.
then okay, and I should probably say what I mean by scale-free too, which is that there are general
Hmm.
principles for going from one level
Hmm.
to the next that don't really depend on which level
Yes.
you're at. There now, and by the way, if there is a scale-free
Hmm.
aspect to this, then this is where science shines. We can then begin to understand
Right.
the general principles of transcendence that apply
Mm.
no matter where you are, and then we could get scientific tools to really help accelerate the process. So now I'll listen
Right.
to about scale free from your
Now,
point.
brace yourself. Um, this is where it gets complicated for the average listener. Now, I mentioned last time the principle of strings. Now, in higher spirit
People
of
of all,
strings, in higher spirituality, one will view what one is like the deepest essence of what one is. It can be observed as strings, and each string represents a certain vibration, a certain code. And in manifested reality, that is what becomes the kind of the source code in mathematics of that. You can call it soul, atma, whatever you want. But when it's being observed, it's like you could have billions and billions of strings. Each of them represents a specific principle, specific pathway, a specific something that is unique to you. And what one sees is like every experience we have will activate certain strings, certain combinations. And as it like even universes are based on these strings. Whenever you combine two strings, they will of course mean something specific, but they will also create dimension. They will also create laws of nature because how strings vibrate together will determine the level of resistance in that kind of combination that will be translated into two different variations of space and time. So it means that each string develops individually. So it means that you're not in one level of consciousness. You're in billions of different levels of consciousness at the same time, and each combination of them also represents a different level of consciousness. Because it's all about, if you have a string, just say that it's this long, and when observing a specific string, you can observe how much of this string has been realized. And we talk, the principle of realization is like how much resistance is there in this string? How close is this to the realization of absolute oneness through this principle? So, spiritual, the spiritual journey and the spiritual expansion is really about also measuring how, like the level of realization through each string. And it means that based on your journey, based on your expressions and incarnations and whatever, all these strings will be in different levels of realization. And it can also be, not all strings will be translated into all lifetimes. So basically, you should assume that the strings available for like this particular lifetime is just a tiny, tiny fraction of your complete set of strings. So, but even in a person's life, when we are dealing with self-growth work, I think everyone can recognize that in one moment, in one situation, they can have a sense, oh, I'm really in an expanded awareness, I'm really in alignment. And then 2 seconds later, they're just an animal. Because it can shift like that based on how we're being triggered. And it's basically due to the different strings and the combination being triggered by whatever we experience. And that will be the kind of starting point of our interaction, because that will represent the active level of consciousness being mirrored through that manifestation. And that's the starting point. So it basically means that our whole life consists of millions upon millions of micro journeys. These like little movements where had different starting points with different strings. So when we look at that from afar, it's absolutely seamless. It's just like all of these strings that represents who are spiritually in different levels, different expressions, but we can all kind of like look at and kind of trace the level of realization in each one of them. And what we often define as the overall level of consciousness in an individual will be when you look at all the strings kind of as one, and then we can say, okay, what is kind of the average level here? But there will be enormous individual differences. So understanding like strings from a more spiritual perspective, it provides an explanation for basically everything and how it comes into being, because it can be studied, it can be observed, but one does not, of course, in this reality have the necessary kind of science to do so. But I think it will happen at some point, because it's also a matter of being able to detect and understand what a certain level of realization is and how that translates into matter.
So I really like your idea about strings and the vibrations of strings. And I think that it's quite pertinent that you brought that up in terms of this possibility of a scale-free description of this process of moving from one spiritual level to not just an expansion within the level, but moving to a completely different level. And what's striking is that our work on consciousness from a mathematical point of view has come to the same conclusion in mathematical terms. So what we're working with is a mathematical model of what we call conscious agents that are interacting. And so it's a dynamical systems approach. It's a complex, it's where you have to use like network information theory and so forth. But what we get are, the big idea is that we're looking at right now, I'm not saying it's the final word, but the current idea that we're playing with right now is that to get conscious agents interacting to create new levels of consciousness, we have to look at what we call the asymptotic or long-term behavior of the conscious agents. And when we actually classify that using theory of Markovian kernels and so forth, what we find is that the long-term behavior is classified by, you can call them vibrations. It's or permutations. So there are these things that are called affine permutations that we can use to classify the possible long-term behaviors. And what's interesting there is that these long-term asymptotic stabilities provide, at one level, they seem to be related to how the agents at one level are getting into sort of maximal mutual understanding of each other, and in the process then creating a transcendent new level with new primitives
Exactly.
of consciousness, where the primitives see the primitives below at one level are whatever they are, but when you look at the asymptotic behavior of the consciousness using those primitives, you get
Yes.
new primitives
Yes.
at a higher level, which are like the vibrations of these strings that you were talking about, the or what we would call the asymptotic behavior, and we can classify it like eigenvalues of operators and so forth. And and that has been the big idea that my team has been thinking about, could be a key scale-free notion for going from one level of
Yes.
consciousness to another. Whatever the primitives are at one level, you have agents that sort of share those primitives interacting. They come to a stable or semi-stable asymptotic
Mm-hmm.
interaction of locally greater mutual understanding, and that process then leads to a higher level where the primitives at the higher level are these infinite trajectories of
Right.
interactions at the lower level. So it's not just one interaction at the lower level, it's this whole lifetime of trajectories that
Yeah.
becomes a primitive
Yes.
at the higher
Like,
level. And that might
yes.
be the
The
scale free.
way I explain this is basically looking at like pressure equalization. Because when two
Okay.
agents meet, it means that they are different. It means that they have different information. And if we can also think that they have a different kind of like path of evolution. When you have then two agents of different information, it basically means that it will be an equalization of pressure. Basically, the information that is kind of higher in one agent will then start to balance out the other one. So there will be an exchange of information, and both of them will be influenced. And that is what we spiritually call co-creation. It's basically something that happens organically when two agents meet. The differences between them will start to kind of equalize, but that equalization process in itself will be kind of translated into a kind of third agent, a new level of consciousness, new space. Because basically, if you think of each string, each agent as a set of natural laws upon themselves, when they are combined and when they interact, a kind of new dimension, a new set of natural laws will be the result. And this is why, as I explained last time, this process never stops. Because whenever two agents will meet, a third one will be created. And because it's infinite, it will absolutely never stop. And this is also, when we look at even the human journey, our journey is the result of interactions with others. Everything we know, all our experiences are co-creations, and we are affected. So whenever we meet someone and they influence us, we change because of that exchange. And it's just it is ongoing continuously on all levels of manifestation in the entire universe. And it I can observe, and like in spirituality, this is well known, it just happens because of that kind of principle of kind of pressure equalization, which is basically also like when two things vibrate differently, like they will kind of seek being kind of in tune. And that, just like when you play in an orchestra, all the instruments will start to kind of tuning themselves together. They will find that kind of balancing kind of point, that balancing principle that enables that communication and that exchange. So if you think of, just like if you go to see a symphony orchestra, what you hear like the first 10 minutes is everyone just tuning their instruments. That happens. And it never stops. And again, you can see it with people, you can see it with any forms of manifestations, even between different dimensions and level of consciousness. So, for instance, the classic way of dealing with the spiritual teacher of high consciousness in most traditions is students know that just being around him will transform them. He doesn't have to say anything ever, but just the presence in itself. And through this kind of dynamic process, they will grow into higher level of consciousness. It's inevitable. And this has always been the most prominent part of like real studies in spirituality. It's not the words, it's not the text, it's simply being close to an individual of a certain level of consciousness.
Very interesting. Well, that certainly makes sense from the point of view of what we're studying in the science as well. It's what we're talking about is at least partly captured by what we call spectral analysis in like spectral graph theory and so forth, where we're looking. Spectrum has to do with the frequencies of vibrations, right? That's what it's about. And what you're looking at is the asymptotic behaviors and classifying them. And in some sense, if you capture the spectrum of some dynamical system, you've captured an important aspect of its essence. You don't see each step by step of the dynamics, but you see the big trends in it. And it's those big trends that then are the primitives for a next level. So it seems to me that this is one place where, again, sort of my goal here is to find a profitable convergence of science and spirituality, where there's a cross-fertilization of ideas that leads to real progress over the next few decades, like new tools for science and new tools for spirituality, where we get better at the science and we get better at helping people to move, to transcend and move as individuals to higher levels of their own potential in consciousness. We would love to, I think, get to the point where we can help both science and individuals and their spirituality to accelerate their growth, accelerate not get stuck in one particular resistance, that using your terminology, for so long, to be able to blow through resistances at perhaps a greater pace to really explore. I mean, as a scientist, I can say that it would be really nice if scientists were more able to blow past their resistances. Like in the late 1800s, many physicists thought that Newton was it, that physics was done, and this was the not universal but widely received opinion, and they in fact discouraged some bright young people from going into physics because it was basically all over, and so that, I mean, talk about resistance. That's huge, as being stuck in one framework and not willing to think out of the box.
You see the same thing in spirituality. I would say like it's almost worse, because when you look at spiritual traditions, it's all about kind of maintaining the teachings and kind of sticking with the models and practices and beliefs, and very often when teachers and consciousness evolves, people don't necessarily recognize it because they still use the old traditions as a template. Not understanding that, teachers are incarnated 2,000 years ago. They had a lower level of consciousness because the whole of humanity was at a lower level. So when you stretch today and you really study spirituality and like you do it for real, your starting point is much higher. So when you do the same thing in a way, but with new tools, you will get further and you will have insights that are on a much higher level than the teachers in the past. So in spirituality, one definitely has this challenge of kind of sticking with the old, and the older the better. And in science, at least, one understands that, yeah, older the better, no, not true. So I think this is also an aspect. I'm trying to teach people this, to question everything, to not get stuck, and also learn from science in anticipating the discovery that will change everything, and wanting that to happen instead of just repeating old truths. I always say that whatever truth you may think you have, it has an expiry date. And if you think it doesn't, I'm sorry, you're wrong. Because life goes on. Like every truth, every insight, it has a short shelf life. And the further you go, it's just like cooking. If you don't know how to cook, you prefer foods with long shelf life. It's canned food, it's dried food, like it's all of that you can keep in the freezer. The more you know about food, the fresher foods you want to buy. And it's the same thing. So the further you go along spiritually, the more you want everything to be current, because you're exploring in real time without beliefs, without dogma, without anything, because you know how to explore, how to interpret. And that's basically scientific methodology transferred into spirituality.
Right, yeah, I couldn't agree more. And the issue about dogma is critical both in science
Yeah.
and spirituality. We need to have this
Yes.
interesting balance. Of course, we have to be students of the current knowledge and of the current ideas, because
Yes.
that's where we are. And so you cannot transform and be the leader until you first are the diligent student and really understand that tradition or that scientific discipline fully. And then, and only then, are you going to have the tools to go beyond. But it's very easy in the process of becoming a student to become a dogmatic student.
Exactly.
And that's the issue. A respectful student, yes. A student that appreciates the treasures that are being given to you, yes. But also a student that's willing to say, there's something else. There's something more. And now that I have paid my dues and learned this, I have the tools to go beyond. And that's how we're going to, in science, and I think also certainly in science, and I believe also in spirituality, dogmatism is the bane of learning. It prevents learning. So on the other hand, it's not being the revolutionary at all costs from the get-go. You haven't earned the right to be a revolutionary because you don't know what you're revolting against yet. You need to first master the current framework to a sufficient degree that you then can first, once you have mastered it, you probably won't be so dismissive of it. You'll probably appreciate its strengths while also seeing its weaknesses and seeing how to then
Exactly,
move
because
beyond.
it's basically evolution. We always have to build on the past, and you have to know the past, because you cannot just pull things out of thin air. Both in spirituality and in science, it's about going beyond current knowledge, going beyond whatever is established as truth. But you can't do that unless you fully understand the past. So it's like, even I see when people in modern spirituality, when they don't understand the traditions, they are ignorant, because in the traditions, there's a lot of insight, a lot of knowledge, a lot of practices that figure out really, intricate, sophisticated principles. And if you don't study, you don't have that framework, you don't have that foundation that enables you to, then apply critical thinking and to stretch and bend and go beyond it. You will have a very weak foundation. You think you're just like pulling things out of thin air, and your explorations will lack that kind of quality. You need to understand the kind of knowledge that has brought you to that position in order to make it dissolve in a way. So I think it's so important to have the utmost respect for both science and spirituality and how it has kind of been building through human history, and that we're now at a point where we really have to kind of take bigger leaps, but we cannot do that without that structure that has been built by the people that came before us.
Yeah, I agree. And as you're speaking, another thing that occurs to me is, and it's an example of this, in the sciences, the best scientific framework we have for understanding human nature is evolutionary psychology, which is not to say that I think it's the final word, right? This just in the spirit of what we've just been talking about. To say that I think it's the best scientific theory that we have so far means that that's as far as we've gotten, and so we need to understand that tool, and then we need to understand how to transcend it. But right now we just have that tool. And in evolutionary psychology, what's interesting is, first I should just say that it is remarkable the range of human behaviors and human emotions that can be explained and predicted using the tools of evolutionary psychology. So I mean, it's truly stunning how powerful it is, even though, and this is the part of the interesting thing, it's definitely not starting from what we would call a spiritual framework, right? It's starting from, well, maybe it is starting from a spiritual framework, but it's interesting. It's starting from the limitations aspect that you talked about, right? Evolution by natural selection really gets going because there are limits. We have to compete for resources. Now, maybe that notion of limitation is an artifact of our misperceptions, but nevertheless, that's the framework in which evolutionary theory gets going, because if there were no restricted resources, then you and I wouldn't have to compete. There would be no selection pressures. But within that framework, one thing that has been pointed out by Dan Sperber and Hugo Mercier in their book Enigma of Reason is they ask, why do we have the ability to do reason and logic? And you might think, well, it evolved so that we could actually figure out the truth and seek the truth. And they say, no, that we're a human, that the human species is a social species. So we're a very social species, and that we evolved the ability to have language, and especially reason and logic, as a tool of social persuasion. So I can't bring down that woolly mammoth by myself. I need a bunch of other people to help me. And I've got an idea how to do it. And I need to persuade Joe and Tom and Mary and how I think we should bring down that woolly mammoth. So I'm using reason and logic to persuade everybody else that I would be a good leader. I've got good ideas, and this is the way to do it. And that leads to the prediction that we would have what's called a confirmation bias, that we will look for evidence that supports what we already believe, as opposed to being dispassionate and looking for evidence that would perhaps not only support us, but also disconfirm what we believe.
But still,
it
is changing because, as we also talked about last time, I again, operate with two different versions of consciousness, the horizontal and the vertical one. And the thing is that in the horizontal, it's only about survival. It's basically keeping yourself alive and then have kids and try to survive for as long as possible. So and their kind of rules of the game is the value system that creates the hierarchy, and
Right.
it all depends on how we define survival. Because today we have two main levels of survival. We have the physical one and the social one, and the social one is becoming more and more intricate. But for instance, one thing that is changing when it comes to what will give you points in the social hierarchy today, for instance, it's about self-expression more than what you do. So if we go back a couple of generations, you'll get a status. You could become famous for having done something great. Today, you'll get famous for expressing yourself. And older people don't get this. Like, what is that all about? The rules have changed. So how you score points that will make you kind of like rise in the hierarchy of social structure is changed. So we will always, as a species, kind of redefine the rules of survival. And now, because we are expanding, how we define survival will also include self-expression, learning to grow and heal, how we are as humans, because we do not define ourselves as humans just by the group survival and the function and the roles. If we just go back a couple of generations, you had very clear gender roles. You had very clear expectations of who you were supposed to be and what you're supposed to do. And if you did the right things, then you're a good person. We have kind of demolished that as a species, at least in our part of the world. It's about discovering yourself. It's about being on a journey. It's setting yourself free from all those definitions and limitations, which means that the rules of survival have changed. I mean, still in the horizontal consciousness, we're now open to the idea of learning, going beyond, because the personal journey in the horizontal is now starting to get intertwined with a spiritual one that was always about that discovery, that expression, understanding that you are on a very unique journey. And even like as a kind of social life form, we're starting to get to that place of evolution where survival for most people is now also about the personal journey. It's not about just being part of the collective survival structures.
Right. That makes sense. And partly we can do that because we're now to the position where we're not spending all of our 99% of our time
Exactly.
just staying
Yes.
alive, right? So we have time on our hands to actually to to think about who we are, what we're doing,
Yeah.
and why. And I like the notion you bring up of the horizontal and the vertical dimensions of consciousness in all this. And as a scientist, I'll as you I think rightly pointed out, the evolutionary psychology kinds of concepts and so forth are probably more like in this horizontal um, plane, and there we have no better tools for explaining human behavior in that plane. They're incredibly powerful tools, and so what I would like as a scientist then is a scientific theory about the vertical level of consciousness
Yeah.
that we've been talking about, but that ties precisely into this horizontal level with evolutionary psychology. And the nice thing about this is that whatever theory we build of the vertical, which is going to be a deeper theory than the evolutionary psychology, it has to you have to ask yourself, how will I know if I've got the
Mm.
right theory, for the vertical? It's really hard. How do I know I'm on the right track? Well, you can never know for sure, but one constraint is when you project the deeper theory back into what you already have, namely like
Yes.
evolutionary psychology. You better get back evolutionary psychology as the projection of the deeper theory, or your deeper theory is probably wrong. And the same thing is
Yes.
true in physics, right? When the physicists are looking for something outside of space-time, how do you know that you're on the right track, right? We're shooting in the dark here. How do we, well, the neat thing is when you project whatever you've got back into space-time, you better make the same predictions for like scattering events at the Large Hadron Collider that our current theories in physics make,
Yeah.
or you're wrong, right? So it's not just a free-for-all when you go beyond your current framework. The current framework does provide what we call boundary conditions on a deeper theory. The deeper theory needs to project in and agree with what we see inside this framework to have a coherent whole. So there will be this way that we can ask as we try to go on the vertical dimension of consciousness, are our ideas completely unconstrained? I don't think so. I think that there will be constraints from the current
Absolutely.
horizontal
And I think
level.
also, because it's all math, it means that you can trace the impact. And sometimes I explain this by, when they first discovered the HIV virus, they did not see it, but they could see the impact. So it was basically, defining that this virus exists based on the impact it had on the body. And it's the same thing. When you're dealing with something
Right.
beyond your current level of understanding, it is about kind of tracing the impact and being able to see that. And then
Yes.
when you interact with that kind of agent, see does that change anything and how does it change? So the vertical impact is absolute. And when the vertical consciousness changes, you can absolutely see it in the horizontal. But you can't change the vertical from the horizontal, but you can change the horizontal from the vertical. So it's fully possible to observe the dynamic between the two. And I've spent so much time both teaching this and trying to find better ways to explain it. So just around this one thing by itself, I could probably, talk for several months without stop. So, I could totally assist you in building these theories because it's simply a matter of observing how this dynamic happens and be able to see what are we looking for. How can we trace the presence of the vertical in the horizontal? And that's fully possible.
Well, that sounds like a great topic for our
Yeah,
next conversation.